Hello, everybody, and welcome to our book launch of Borderless Living. It's been 15 years in the making. A lot of different arrangements of different webinars, different seminars that we've put together over the course of the years, and I know a lot of you have been in attendance, so thank you for that. We'll give everybody a chance to join in. Oh, we've got a great group, lots of recognizable names in here, so thank you for joining. Now, first and foremost, any questions you might have, anything you want to post, go ahead and please put it into the chat or the Q&A. We have our team available on this call also to answer some of those questions, and any that we don't have time to get to today, we'll go ahead and try to email you back in the next few days so that we can go ahead and do so. I think everybody should be able to see my screen at this point in time. Perfect. Well, in talking about the new book, first and foremost, if you jump on Amazon today only, and you put in Borderless Living, you'll notice that the Kindle edition, as a big thank you to all of you, is only 99 cents. If you have any troubles, just drop an email over to Paulina at dunhillfinancial.com, and we'll make sure that you can enjoy this journey with us. But essentially, what we're trying to help you with is navigating the journey of moving abroad and dealing with your finances as an American abroad. To us, the most important part of tackling any big issue can be learned from one of our favorite economists, Takeru Kobayashi. Takeru Kobayashi is not your typical economist. He studied economics in Japan and decided to use how he was framing questions as a means to become the Japanese, well, not just the Japanese, I'm sorry, the worldwide hot dog eating champion of the world. He broke down the entire process of eating hot dogs into a different way. Instead of just trying to shove as many hot dogs down his throat as possible and chew them and swallow them like the larger fellows had been doing for 100 years, eating 10 to 12 hot dogs in about 10 minutes, he separated the hot dog from the bun, split it in two, which is called the King Solomon effect for biblical reasons, tossed it in his throat so it would actually go down his esophagus as a half piece with that skin on the side of it, dropping down his esophagus into his belly while he bounced, and then using a little bit of olive oil to drink down the buns as fast as possible, which kept his jaws from getting too tight and tiring down. He was able to eat over 70 hot dogs in 10 minutes by using this process, smashing the old records by over 50 hot dogs in that 10-minute span, i.e., by building a replicable process and being able to do that over and over again, he was able to find a way to smash records. But he had to break down a few priorities of what was going to be the most exhaustive part of eating hot dogs. So in everything we do, we want to go ahead and frame what are the most important priorities in achieving our goals. Not to get too philosophical, but Confucius said, if you chase two rabbits, you end up catching neither of them. So we want to make sure we have our top priorities and come down for each of those goals to make sure that we can smash records and make sure that as Americans abroad, we can be as happy as possible. We broke it down into 4 priorities. How we're going to be taxed as Americans abroad. You've heard it a million times before. As Americans, we're taxed on citizens-based taxation, but it's not always a bad thing. We can frame these things sometimes into a good regard. And in certain countries, you're able to actually benefit from the fact that we're taxed in America and your home country, because lots of countries, and in the appendix, it goes through all of them, have double taxation treaties with the United States. And depending on the country, sometimes that means you'll be able to double dip on investing in retirement accounts, getting more money deferred over the course of time. Other times, it will give you the opportunity to be taxed in America instead of those countries. Jonathan Hadida, our good friend over at Hadida Tax, is quoted in here that the French double taxation agreement is the bee's knees. His favorite words, the bee's knees. And it gives you a great opportunity to sometimes be taxed at a lower rate than you would back in the States. Because, as you know, 43 states in America actually have state income tax. You can become non-resident in those states, maybe become resident in the 7 that don't have any income tax. Before you get over to France, you'll pay less tax in France than you did when you were in New York or California or Chicago. So taxation is not always a bad thing. It gives you the opportunity to navigate it and use those tax treaties. But you need to be aware of those tax treaties and how they work and where they'll place on different functions. And it's going to be different for every individual person. There's some clients that Spain and Portugal are great countries to retire in. There's others where it's a nightmare. And it's all to do with the retirement accounts, distributions from IRAs, and your status. Same thing when it comes to Italy. Italy offers some great treatment with the 7% tax regime. You need to focus on when are you going to be taking out which monies where. And that's to where taxation is not always a horrible thing. It's trying to navigate those portions. The retirement portion. Everybody's retirement plan is going to be probably one of their biggest expenses that they're saving up for. And this is where the second form of the double taxation treatments come. And that second form are totalization agreements. Totalization agreements are basically when Social Security systems pair up to make sure that you don't lose your benefits just because you moved out of the country. So, for example, most European countries have a totalization agreement with America. So even if you didn't get your 40 credits of eligibility in Social Security in America, you'll still receive a payment from the U.S. Social Security. It's going to be proportional of that time that you spent there, but essentially you'll still get to have those two separate Social Security systems. They won't know that you worked in another country, so you have to be aware of that totalization agreement to approach the U.S. Social Security system to let them know I don't have enough credits, but I'm still eligible. Please let me apply for Social Security. So those retirement systems become important. And this is an evolving landscape. For example, here in the UK, US IRAs have finally been recognized that if you take it out as a lump sum distribution, it can be taxed in the US instead of the UK. This was just a determination at the beginning of this year. So this is a brand new strategy that we can utilize, that if we can find a way to take all of our IRA out in one lump sum, live off other assets at different times, we could be taxable in the US, which is most likely a lower rate than what we have currently here in the UK. So build yourself a long-term trajectory. Sometimes that tax differential won't be big enough to actually take that into consideration, and therefore we want to wait on that and get the deferral of those retirement plans. It depends on your age, it depends on your needs. But again, the awareness of those totalization agreements and those local agreements is huge. Now, where it shrinks down, estate planning, we have double taxation agreements for estate taxation, but there's a lot fewer of them than there are totalization agreements or double taxation agreements. Oh, apologies. I guess I need to take this to full screen. Window. It is in full screen right now. Apologies. Is it not big enough right now? How about that? When it comes to those estate planning double taxation treaties, If you have an estate that's under $15 million and you're still a W-9, most likely in many countries, the estate taxes are higher than what they would be back in the States. And therefore, you just have to make sure that you have a will that works in both countries. Whereas if you're in a country like Portugal or Italy, Italy has a 4% estate tax. Essentially, estate taxation becomes very important. The most important part is that a lot of countries define that you're still taxed on worldwide income, but they might have, say, Napoleonic rule. The French still have Napoleonic rule, but the European government's come in to save the day to say you can opt out of Napoleonic rule, which would be your direct descendants get paid no matter what you're doing. If you use the Brussels 4 Amendment, you're able to opt out of that and say, I want to use the American rules. Notice it affects your actual inheritors, but it doesn't affect the tax. So you'll still be taxed at those higher rates. You're not opting for the American tax system. You're opting for those beneficiaries and those local inheritance rules. So you want to work with those different plans when it comes to estate planning. Now, the part that I'm passionate about is the investment side of things. And we'll get into currencies later on, but we want to think about the world in a completely different way if we're an American living abroad. I can't control what currency your pension or your Social Security are going to be paid in. Those are going to be in US dollars, but we can actually control how we're going to set up and structure our different investments to make sure that we're dealing with those as an American expat. So these are our big challenges, and you have to prioritize which ones become most important to structure first to make sure that you're ready to move abroad. Double taxation treaties are the big thing for us as Americans. Whether you're working, retired, whether it's your investments and the structuring of your investments, you have to understand them and you have to break them down. There are great guides on the IRS website for each country's double taxation treaty to understand them better. And ChatGPT can help you quite a bit, but essentially you want to make sure you run this by your tax preparers on both sides. I find the most important part of the double taxation treaty is to make sure that your representative that's doing your, say, French taxes is in line with the person doing your American taxes, because the worst part is if one of them misses that and you end up paying taxes twice, even though the treaty states that you only owe it once. So communication between your team is very important. I know several firms have a department that takes care of both ends. Again, our friend Jonathan Hadida takes care of both the French taxes and the American taxes. That means you know that the two of them are actually working together. So I would definitely recommend making sure that you have a good team surrounding you when it comes to these double taxation agreements, and that you should be having those conversations openly with the accountants and your financial planner to make sure that, for instance, the number of our clients whose accounts, this doesn't include France, but their accounts would be paying off dividends, but they own tons of municipal bonds inside of their portfolio, and yet they're taxed on their foreign income. Essentially, they're not getting any benefit from owning municipal bonds. They were great tools while they lived in America. Once they move abroad, they might not be so much unless you're in a country where you can bring the taxation back to America. So make sure that you look for that double taxation treaty that works for you and that you communicate thoroughly between those. And that you start with that view of getting things right, one little small thing at a time, like McRaven taught us, of making your bed at the beginning of the day, because there might be sharks out there. If you don't know what I'm referring to, There's a great commencement speech that he put together that we talk about in the book to make sure you make your bet each day. Banking is a huge issue for us Americans abroad. Some countries are welcoming to Americans, others aren't so welcoming. There's tons of literature on this, and we talk about it some, that you want to make sure you have 3 different banking situations. You most likely want to keep your bank back in the US. The importance of keeping your bank back in the US has more to do with little things like what happens if I receive a check from the IRS. Yes, I received one this year. I had to mail the check back to the US. It's easier to go to an American bank to deposit a check than it is a European bank where they haven't had checks for a lot longer period of time. It also keeps your credit score going in America, even though you've moved abroad. And I know your credit score is only important if you end up boomeranging back to the States, but having to rebuild your credit score as an adult instead of as a university graduate is much more stressful and much harder to reopen those types of structures. So keeping a bank account open, especially if you've had a bank account that's been open for a long time, always a good idea to keep things copacetic in those regards. You want to have a bank in your local country. Now, more of the fintech companies that are app-based are becoming full-fledged banks, which gives you local credit. So here in the UK, Monzo and Revolut have both become banks, and therefore they're starting to issue a credit score. And that is a great way to make sure that you'd have the ability to borrow on a mortgage over here. But others are not. They're wonderful utilities like Wise to go ahead and convert money cheaply, which you need. That's that third pillar of what you need for banking as a means to get dollars to euros very cheap. But essentially, you're not in a position to where you're building credit with all of the fintechs. So make sure you have a local bank to pay those utility bills, to build your credit score locally, and to be able to get everything out locally, but make sure to have something in between to get the currencies back and forth. Many of the local banks in the US will charge 1.5%, 2% on currency conversions plus international wire fees. On my Wise account, I pay 0.32% for every single currency conversion that I make on Wise. And it's not to say that there's not others that charge 0.25 or 0.4. Those are all great prices. I just don't want you to be paying 1.5% to 2% to a bank that's not really offering you anything different than what an online app would be. The exception that I would make is when you're making a large transfer and you negotiate with the institutions. Sometimes it's nice to have somebody on the phone to talk to. So essentially, I don't mind paying a little bit more. If I'm moving over $500,000, I might pay 40 or 50 basis points just to make sure if something's going wrong and the notaire or the notary is asking, where is this at? How's this working? That you have somebody to call to see what's going wrong. We definitely need to protect our retirement savings while we're living abroad. And there's 2 major functions that we need to really think about. The first one is, how are we going to be taxed on distributions? And some of these might be accidental distributions through the forms of required minimum distributions. So if you're not 72 years old or older just yet, what you might want to do is you might want to start with Roth conversion strategies so that you're not forced to take money out when you're not wanting or needing those funds. The other strategies could be taking funds out earlier or later from those IRAs when you're not living in countries that are not attractive for those IRAs. But building these types of strategies early to account for those potentially heavier taxes, if you're only going to be places for a short period of time, is significantly important. because even though we've accumulated those in the States, it's dependent on that double taxation treaty of how that's going to be taxed. So make sure you're aware. The second thing is what's inside of it. If we have a ton of US dollars in cash or money market, if all of a sudden the dollar swings like it has the last 6 months by, 15%, even though we've made 3 or 4% on our money in dollar terms, we've lost 11% after we account for the currency swing. So we want to take that into effect and make sure that we have a portfolio that meets our needs every single day during our retirement. There's lots of rumors circling around when it comes to Social Security. The big, beautiful tax bill definitely brought about a lot of fears that are going along. But we have to remember the intention of Social Security when it was first developed by Bismarck was to get people to retire so that the young could get jobs. It wasn't effectively to make sure everybody was comfortable in their retirement. So we still have to remember retirement planning is built on a 3-pillar system: our corporate pension, our government pension, and our personal savings. That Social Security is not going to be enough inside of there. And to add to that, as I've already stated, if you have a Social Security and you live abroad, if the country is not pegged to the US dollar, you could end up having a deficit in certain years and not in others. So we have to do some additional planning because that's going to be paid out in dollars. That's the bad news. The good news is essentially we've seen with heavy inflation, they've continued to increase those payments to meet those inflation increases. So we still get a better inflation adjustment than rather than most other countries that don't adjust them as much for inflation. And that means at least you've got something to protect yourself. This might play into account whether you take your Social Security early, midterm, or late. If you were in a couple back in the States, the only way to game the Social Security system is if you have a high earner and a low earner, and you are able to take, for the high earner, to take that later so that the low earner, if that high earner passes away, can go ahead and take the higher Social Security if the second person dies early. That's the only way that you can game Social Security based on the death charts. That being said, there might be strategies of taking them earlier or later to correspond with your cash flow needs from now until retirement. That depends on how much you have in investments and how much you will need. So you definitely want to build that into your strategy. But it all plays into how you look at currencies. And every economist loves to play on the Economist magazine's valuation of the PPI, the Purchasing Power Index. The Purchasing Power Index basically grades how each country views the price of different goods. In the 1970s, the Economist magazine came up with the Big Mac Index as a satirical laugh. Hey, the ingredients in a Big Mac are pretty much the same from every single country. There's some interesting ones. There's some India, for example, is a veggie mac. In parts of Africa where McDonald's isn't present, they use the KFC index, so the price of fried chicken. So they adapt it somewhat, but for the most part, they're able to see what the price of a Big Mac is from each and every one of the different countries, and therefore what currencies are overpriced and which currencies are underpriced. And in our evaluation over the last 15 years, it's been a fun evaluation to see the dollar is one of only 4 currencies that are remaining that are still expensive. Switzerland, Sweden, and Norway being the other 3. And we've really seen this as Americans leaving America for the last 15 years as the dollar did really well. Essentially, what we've been able to do is we've been able to vacation, and travel very, very well on weak currencies across the board. The Trump administration, love them or hate them, they are doing the opposite to us. They're trying to push down the dollar. And we can pretend like this is a new game in town, but Reagan and Nixon did the exact same thing. And the important thing that I want you all to take away from both Nixon and Reagan is that it outlasted their presidencies significantly. When we try to devalue something, we can't control the exact stopping point. So we've spent 10, 15 years with the dollar increasing. The dollar is one of the expensive currencies in the world. Now we've got a president trying to decrease the value. So we need to be vigilant of what's going on and make sure that we plan for what happens if it actually decreases for long periods of time. We don't know where it will end or where it will bottom out. And we're not worried about that if we go ahead and make sure that our financial plan is built to where we invest some of our assets in the currencies that we're going to be living on. Now, I would divide my portfolio into two different parts, stocks and bonds. Stocks being that we're investing in individual companies and their success. So they have lots more potential return, but also they can go bankrupt. Bonds, we're just lending people money and getting paid interest. As long as they don't go bust, we get our money back with some interest. So a little less upside, but also a little less downside. On the stock side of things, companies are global nowadays. When we think of the Magnificent Seven, the top 7 tech companies in America, the 2 largest companies, two of those 7 companies, their CEOs are from India. 2 of them, their biggest market is in India. So I don't know if we can really say that the biggest companies in America are really fully American. Actually, 60% of their revenue comes from abroad, which is why every time that we see the dollar going down in value, you're seeing the S&P 500 go up in value because those earnings are coming in at higher values. You can also look for the last 20 years. The same things happen for a lot of other emerging market exchanges where the stock market becomes correlated in the opposite way to the actual currency. That is really why that's the case. And that's to where if we're buying multinationals across the world, it doesn't matter so much where they're based. It matters where they're getting their revenue from. We can use examples like Nestle. Most of their products are not sold in Switzerland, but essentially you're buying a Swiss company. Tata Motors, they own Twinings Tea over here in the UK and Jaguar and Range Rover, which have sales globally. So therefore, are they really based on the rupee, or are they getting those global sales from all of these other subsidiaries? But when we're talking about the biggest companies in the world, those Magnificent Seven, they're global companies. So what we really need to be focused on there is where that revenue comes from. And that's to where we can put that on the side and say, we just need to have a global mix of companies that are going to grow, that are going to be part of the technological revolution. We can't ignore AI right now. I understand only 5% of AI companies are actually posting a profit at this point in time, but that's because of the huge investments they're having to make into them. Every company is going to have some sort of linkage to AI in the future. So we know we need to be in the growth sectors. We know that we need to have that development, but we need to be diversified on that revenue. And that will keep us from having to worry about, I need to buy companies in Europe and because I live in Europe. The bond side of the portfolio is a lot different. If we own all US bonds, which most every US retirement account would have all of their fixed income in US bonds, we stand to have full currency risk. And if we're on that shorter end, we could see ourselves losing money in euros when the euro goes down. When the euro goes up in value if we own just CDs in the States or the lights. So what we want to do is we want to own local local currencies. And make sure that we avoid that currency risk. So if you have a rainy day fund, that money that you need to have just in case you have an emergency in the next 6 months, if you live in Europe, make sure that you have that in euros. I understand you're going to get closer to 2% on your money rather than 4% in the States. But without having that currency risk, you're in a much better position. When it comes to long-term bonds, we can have a mix of different parts. We're not saying you don't want to have any US bonds. We know that interest rates have further to fall in the US. So we have our long-term bonds in the US and our short to mid-term bonds in Europe and globally. It just diversifies us off that risk. So make sure you manage that currency risk and it can meet any of those changes, i.e., that we don't have to stress about what the Trump administration is working on this week or next. Then it comes to the most important part. We want to make sure we adapt and succeed in our new country. We've all seen the terminal where essentially Victor found his new life right there in Charles de Gaulle's airport. We want to make sure that we're not sitting there offending and building new challenges in our struggles of being an American abroad, but instead expanding our cultures and expanding how things are working. So it's a journey that we want to go on, and we want to make sure we appreciate every little bit so that we can go ahead and essentially have a borderless living, not have to deal with the stress of what's going on there. I'll go into the questions really quick, but I'll also explain a couple of these different pieces. First of all, if you scan that QR code, like I said, on Amazon for today and today only, you can get the Kindle copy for 99 cents. We want to make sure that we get these out into everybody's hands so that they feel comfortable with moving abroad. We're seeing more and more people moving abroad. A lot of people think it's overwhelming. It may feel overwhelming, but if we look at them and tackle the issues one at a time, it's not that bad. It's just like living in the States. We have two websites down at the bottom, DF Direct and Dunhill Financial. Both of them are under the same parent company. But DF Direct is essentially a no minimum and low cost robo-advisor. So if you're back in the States, it's the equivalent of what Betterment is, to where you can send any amount of money on any period of time. There's no commitments, and it charges 0.5% on the account per annum. This is a great means for those emerging affluent individuals, a young person that just needs to put away a small amount per month. This is the way to make sure that you can get going and accomplish your goals. Every financial planner will talk about how if a 20-year-old puts away $250 a month until they're 65, they'll basically be putting away less than $200,000, but it will turn into $1.4 million over the course of those 45 years. So saving early and often is the way to do it, and this is a means to do that. It's also, if you're still a working professional, you're in your 40s and 50s, you have enough for retirement. You don't necessarily need to spend extra money building the financial plan, but you just need to have it managed in a way that's compliant in Europe, United States, and that essentially you don't have to worry about what you can buy and what you can't, or that your broker dealer needs you to have a US address. You're able to use your foreign addresses with DF Direct. So therefore, it's compliant in all jurisdictions listed there. So that's your low-cost solution. If you need a little bit more hands-on, building a full financial plan, going through, a lot of you might have old securities that have low-cost basis, and so therefore you need to build your strategy around some of those old positions that you might have worked there. Dunhill Financial, we're a fully regulated financial planning firm that helps in all types of situations. We have teams for France, Germany, the UK, and then we have a group that just specializes on other countries as well. We really concentrate on people with concentrated positions in different strategies. Sometimes it's worth waiting to move someplace to actually sell one of those concentrated positions, but you might want to protect it in the meantime. Sometimes it's better for you to wait until you get back to the States or another place. So you want to play with those different aspects, but full financial planning shop, and you can drop an inquiry in there, and we'd be happy to have an introductory conversation with you. Um, Oh, Kelly, wonderful to see you over in Florida with Money Corp, a wonderful firm. You can see a couple YouTubes on our with Kelly and the team over at Money Corp that can help with all of your currency transfer needs. But let's see. Sorry, Adrian, I did not get to the full screen mode right there. John has a wonderful question for fintech banks between France and the United States. There's been a slew of different ones that have kind of gone around. Myself, I use Wise for my company, and I use Revolut for my personal money, and it works wonderfully over in France. Great way of moving over euros and the likes. I like to use those for smaller amounts. To me, $5,000 or $10,000, I'm not worried about it if it gets blocked. But the thing I will always put out there with these fintech providers is that essentially you're dealing with a chatbot whenever something goes wrong. And so therefore, if something gets blocked and they want additional data, you're talking to a chatbot. I don't mind that if it's $5,000 or $10,000, but if you're purchasing a house, if you're making a bigger order that needs to get over there, and you end up talking to a chatbot over $500,000, it might be a little bit more frustrating, and the delays can add and stack up into new costs. So we always suggest working with companies like Money Corp, where essentially you're able to make sure that you have somebody right there that you're able to call and talk to a real life person and get it resolved that day so that you're not late with the notaire. So I would suggest each of those three, but in different situations to utilize those. We're starting to look at some of the other newer fintech banks since we're setting up a full-fledged company down in France. And so we'll have more information. So John, if you drop an email over to Cedric Bernier at Dunhill Financial. If you can't jot that down, just email info at Dunhill Financial and it will get passed on to him. He'll send you a full list of the different ones, but essentially it will be mostly a list because we're still in the process of doing some of the due diligence on those. Nancy has a great question on Uncle Warren Buffett, selling off a significant amount of investments, including Apple. Now, Nancy, this is a wonderful question, and I think if we go back in time over the last 50 years, what we'll notice is that Berkshire Hathaway has always had a significant amount of cash. And there is a large reason why Berkshire Hathaway always is sitting on cash. And that's because one of their big businesses is a reinsurance company. Reinsurance companies, essentially, what they do is when, say, statewide insurance in America underwrites all of these homes or all of these cars, they'll take on a certain amount of risk and then they sell the excess risk to companies like Berkshire Hathaway or Swiss Re or the likes. That means if there's a major disaster, i.e., a hurricane in a zone or an earthquake or such, the insurance company that underwrote the insurance is not necessarily going to go bankrupt. There's a bigger entity that would come into place. And that's where most years, when they're sitting on tons of cash, they just get a cash inflow for those premiums for the reinsurance company. This is one of the big reasons why Berkshire has been able to outpace the S&P 500 for a lot of different years. But it means that they have to have that cash available because some of those disasters in the past have included sad events like 9/11. So essentially, they have to have some of this cash. And Warren, he's a value player. He knows when things get expensive, he doesn't want to be in there so that he can jump in and buy as the lender of last result. That means he's underinvested in Apple, Google, Amazon, et cetera, over the course of time. He's gone for that traditional mix, which has given us as financial planners a great means to get a diversifier that still performs decently over the course of time with him. Does it make me panic that he thinks the whole world's going to come to an end? No. It just means that he's not believing in the growth story, but he's never believed in the growth story because he's a value investor. That's the person he is. Uh, for couples who have invested in property in France, not living in France, still working in the US, and not yet secured a long-term visitor visa, what tax and investment considerations need to be addressed? Assuming that a move to France is within 5 to 7 years, what preparation work should be done? Any tax concerns for owning French property? It's a great question. And we have tons of material on France. You know, we love France as a place to invest over the course of time. To me, if you're not living there just yet, there's no real concerns of having that property in this consideration. Apart from if you're renting it, you'll naturally have to declare those. But one strategy you might want to think about is if you're able to secure any borrowing on those assets. If you're able to borrow in euros, that's going to minimize your estate in France. And I say that because right now you live in the US, so you'll be subject to US estate taxation. But the property in France would be subject to estate taxation in France separately. So therefore, if you can have a asset and a liability there in France, that would minimize your estate there in France and minimize your exposure to uh, the European Union at this point in time before you've moved over there. So that might be one strategy in playing with your overall function. The other function is for your investments, you might want to start shifting them slowly over to something that preps you for a European allocation. Like I said, for Reagan and Nixon, we had 10 to 15-year periods where the dollar was sliding. So if we start getting ourselves more international in our exposure, we will actually be better prepped. That's not to say that the dollar can't rebound. It's just to say that if you're definitely going for France, we're going to be um, in a nicer position. Adrian, of course, I've got several signed copies for you of the book. And even better news for everybody else. There's some beautiful quotes from Adrian in the book on investing in real estate as an American abroad. So you'll want to make sure to check those out. For any of you that don't know Adrian, she is the legend from House Hunters International, and she has the best real estate company over in France, can help you with all your needs, especially over in Paris and Nice. We're looking for properties down in Antibes, and she has been so helpful in the entire process to keep me from having to pull my hair out. How does having European investments impact French tax treaty with the US? My understanding was that investments should be US based. This is a beautiful question, and thank you for that. So when I'm saying I want to buy European bonds, I can buy European bonds in a US investment account. So I just want to make sure that I have a US investment account so that I don't have any collectives in Europe. So most countries in Europe, they'll call them UCITS, but even an exchange traded fund that's on the, say, the Frankfurt Exchange, the Milan Exchange, or the London Exchange, those would be considered PFICs, passive foreign investment companies. If I buy an individual stock or an individual bond, essentially they're not PFICs. I own just that individual stock or bond. It doesn't have to be through a US carrier, but I find it easier to go through a US carrier for a few reasons. First of all, you don't have to do an FBAR reporting if you own it in a, say, an interactive broker's account that's stateside. Second of all, you get a 1099. That 1099 essentially means it's going to be easy to file your US taxes. Third of all, you get your SIPC coverage and FDIC coverage for that account. So that means if a Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers happens, You're just moved over to another broker-dealer, but your money is intact. So nothing to worry about there. The last and probably most important reason of why I would keep those investments in the States, even though they don't have to be, is because broker-dealers are cheaper in the States. We have 4 broker-dealers that work in France. One of them is over here in Europe. They charge 0.35% just to hold your money there. That doesn't include our fees. So you're paying a lot more to have the money outside of the States. All of our broker-dealers in the States, that is just a free service of having it there. So much cheaper to do so. But owning an individual stock, individual bond, totally copacetic. Collectives are the problems. Todd asks, does DF Direct allow self-direction on investments? I have a broker-dealer which requires U.S. residency, and I'm about to move to France. No, DF Direct is not a self-direction investment, and it probably never will be because the rules for MiFID, which is the European rules, and the U.S. rules basically collide. The U.S. rules basically state that we always have to say, this is the past performance, but past performance is not indicative of future returns. In other words, hey, I can't guarantee you what kind of investments you would have. For a European investment, I have to disclose what I would expect future returns to be. So financial advisors are allowed to put together a group of ETFs for an investor in Europe, but we're not allowed to actually sell them piecemeal individually because they won't disclose what the expected returns would be for those individuals in a US ETF. That's why you're not finding any of the self-directed companies wanting to support Americans in Europe. So, Todd, what we can offer you is you can reach out to us and we can talk to you about our Dunhill Financial offering if you're wanting to put together a customized portfolio that we can help you manage. But sadly, DF Direct is basically a model in a tin. Thanks for that question. I'm more than halfway through the book. Very, very interesting. And I've referred it to 2 US friends who are considering moving to France. Thank you so much, Calista. I'm glad you're enjoying it. And please do come to me with any questions. And if we can help you or your friends on anything. Okay. Let's see. Lisa asks, what fintech companies for currency transfers would you recommend for an American living abroad and working in Germany? So we covered this a little bit for France, where I was saying Wise and Revolut are the 2 that I use. I've also heard a lot of our German clients use the local German one, which is N26, has been a good one on there. But Lisa, if you drop us an email over at info@dunhill-financial, we have an article with a list of different ones that have been successful in different areas. Julian asks, aren't U.S. citizens who are not high net worth individuals effectively unable to invest in UK ISAs whilst having the diversification offered by funds, assuming we avoid the PFIC trap? Julian, this is a great question. We have an article on this on my LinkedIn. We do offer ISAs. It's not appropriate for every single individual because an American here in the UK can't buy those collectives in the US inside of an ISA. They can outside of it. But in an ISA, you can only have individual stocks, individual bonds, or UK/European collectives. You don't want the European or UK collectives because they'll end up being passive foreign investment companies in the States, i.e. the PFIC trap you're bringing up. So we end up with individual stocks and individual bonds. Now, if you find our ISA portfolios, they have performed extremely well the last 4 or 5 years. But I will put a big asterisk next to that, and this is why we don't go off selling them to every individual. If a non-American comes into our office, we'll say the first thing you should do is go set up an ISA. If you're an American, we'll essentially say, let's build the tax problem before we solve it. And the reason why is because how we build the ISA portfolio is we're trying to build as few stocks in there for it to mimic the S&P 500, which means we don't have as much diversification. It's performed wonderfully the last 4 or 5 years because the biggest parts of the S&P 500 have been the biggest performers. Therefore, we've outperformed. But we always want to heed that with a bit of caution that the best performers of the past might not be the best performers of the future, i.e. past performance is not indicative of future returns. And therefore, if your NVIDIAs and Apples and Microsofts and Googles end up being the worst performers in the portfolios, our ISAs will underperform the benchmark that we're actually trying to mimic. Therefore, the ISAs become a great way of managing taxes for people that have a fully diversified portfolio, and this is a piece. But if this is the only piece, unless it's for long-term money, it might not be the best piece. But Julian, totally happy if you drop us an email. We'll take you through it and see if it fits your situation. We're totally happy to help. And there's a couple other providers that offer similar types of structures. They're all good, but they all have that same nuance of those individual stocks. Bruce asks, can my UK-based daughter, dual US UK citizen, just starting out, one recent grad, one about to graduate this year, use DF Directs to start investing and diversify and be both UK and US compliant? Absolutely. I'm here in the UK. I'm not the same demographic. I am a little bit older than your daughters, but essentially I'm the same demographic of US, UK. All of our portfolios meet all the HMRC guidelines here in the UK and all the US guidelines. So completely copacetic for them to set it up and no minimum on there. You just have to send in US dollars on there. So you can do that through MoneyCorp, through Wise, through Revolut. We're trying to add that extra feature in the near future. Bruce, drop us an email, info@dunhill-financial. We'd be happy to take your daughters through and help with any questions they have. But getting started early and often, best way, Bruce. So good man teaching your daughters right. John asks, could you outline a simplified rental regime in Portugal? I'll tell you what, since that's a little bit more complex, why don't we, if you drop me an email, I will be more than happy to take you through that. Michael asks, how do I set up a foreign investment account? Plenty of broker dealers will offer things for Americans abroad. Like we said, DF Direct, very easy to set that up in that structure. If you're wanting to buy individual stocks and individual bonds and not go through a financial advisor, Interactive Brokers, it's a little bit cumbersome on their back end, but they're the best for Americans not having to navigate those different worlds. But then essentially, there's plenty more that offer those opportunities. We have 10 different broker dealers that we work with. So happy to try to help you find the best one for you if you just drop us an email. In YouTube videos, buying a property in children's names has been suggested as a method to avoid French inheritance taxes. What happens if you do that and your child precedes you in death? That's a very sad situation, Alan, and it does become a complexity, and it depends on how their estate looks. I.e., if you have two children and one of them predeceases you, there might be a changeover on there, but it depends on the full-fledged of the entire structure, and i.e. the size of the property and such. If you drop me an email, happy to connect you with individuals that can build you a full vantage point of exactly what the downsides would be on that if that were to happen. But you don't have to worry about your property. You'll still be able to live in it, no problem. Todd, it was actually, I think you're saying PFIC trap in Todd's question. PFIC is the acronym for Passive Foreign Investment Companies. And the joke that I've overutilized over the years is that your mom wouldn't let you use four-letter words when you were a kid. Your accountant won't let you use four-letter acronyms when it comes to cross-border planning. So PFICs, don't take my word for it. Ask your U.S. tax accountant if you should buy a PFIC, and every single one of them I've ever met has basically said, no, it is a headache, because essentially what happens is if you buy any security of which more than 75% of it is passive, and it is based in a foreign regime, the U.S. will want to tax it in one of two ways, mark-to-market or QEF election. And to describe the two of them, one is a rock, the other one's a hard place. They both stink. Your tax accountant will either have to pay the taxes each and every year, even if you don't sell the security. And that essentially means that you won't be able to offset bad years from good years. So that great advantage of tax harvesting that we talk about every single November, December, you won't be able to take advantage of with that PFIC, which means you're taxed every single year. And if you don't make any money, you don't pay any tax, but you also won't be able to write off that loss to the gain. The other election is basically an impossible computation once you sell it. And that means your accounting bill might be just as high as your tax bill on there. You'll hear plenty of nightmares of people getting huge tax bills. To me, it's also burdensome of filing the taxes that are just as bad as the tax bill. So I always say avoid them. That's why we have things like DF Direct that make it easy for you to get online and just be able to set something up easily. There's 83 firms that just deal with American expats only here in the UK. So it's not like mine's the only shop and we're the only ones doing the right thing. No, there's tons of guys. We're friends with all of them. They're doing an amazing job. It's a simple Google search to find most of us. And so what I would essentially say is make sure to be talking to the professionals that understand how these rules work to keep you from falling into that PFIC trap. Um, let's see. When will you be opening an office in France? Will it be in Paris? Thank you. I love that question. Thank you. We actually opened our French office this year. We have 3 gentlemen down in France, Eric, Dylan, and Cedric. Uh, Dylan and Cedric are over in Biarritz, and Eric is down in Antibes. But Cedric makes it up to Paris on a regular basis, so you can have in-person meetings. Hopefully, once my baby gets a little bit bigger, I'll be back going to Paris on a regular basis to visit my good friend Adrian, and Jonathan comes along and joins us with Daniel Tostado and Jonathan Hadida quite often for events there in Paris. So we do have our office in France. We're happy to meet you in person. If you would prefer, drop us an email at info@dunhill-financial, and we'll make that happen. Reagan asks, what is your advice if our main income comes from rental properties in the U.S., U.S. Social Security income, and part-time income in the U.S.? We purchase property and live in France. Reagan, this is a great problem to have because real estate has done wonderfully for you. 1982 till present, interest rates have been going down, so real estate values have been going up. Now, at the beginning, we talked about how we need to set our priorities because if we try to accomplish too many goals, we'll essentially accomplish none. We need to focus on whether real estate is the investment class that we want going into the future because that's what we understand, which we have plenty of clients that decide on that, or whether we want to make our life in France as easy as possible by not running a business back in the States that will be taxed in France and will be taxed in America. So it will be more complex when you're living in France to own those, and therefore we just need to determine whether that complexity is worthwhile the differential in income needs. A lot of our clients, when they get to retirement, they decide to sell off those properties so that they're not hit with additional taxes in France and those additional aspects of running a company back in the States when you live in France. I tend to believe that it's running a business. I love running my business. I don't want to run a second business of owning real estate and properties because what happens if the toilet gets clogged and I don't want to go fix it or send a plumber or call for a plumber? It's bad enough doing that in my own home. But those are personal decisions that we can help you go through and prioritize which ones come first and which ones come next. And then we can look at different strategies to optimize getting those pieces out. Leslie, thank you so much. We love the cover as well. Paulina did a lot of hard work to get this nice and pretty. Right on the front, you'll see 2 of the big loves of my life. The other 2 are back at home, being my daughter and my partner. But this is Nala on the front of the boat, and if you get our newsletter, you see her in every single newsletter. And that is my beautiful boat, which will be heading up to Marseille in short order so that I can get it over to Antibes to spend more time with my friends Jonathan and Adrian. I thank you all for joining and helping us celebrate publishing this book. Please send me any thoughts you have, any questions you have, good or bad. It's been a joy writing this over all the years and doing all these webinars and such. So please keep in touch, and we will talk to you soon.